So, good evening. Welcome to the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh webinar series on a Monday night. So this is bringing your college to you every week, 7 o'clock on a Monday. My name's Tim Graham. I'm a member of council and I'm based at University Hospitals Birmingham. This evening we're going to run a question and answer session and we are fortunate to have with us this evening Mike Griffin, the President of the College, Rowan Parks, Vice President of the College, and Paula Rajesh, another Vice President of the College. But probably more importantly, we've got Clare McNaught with us as well, who's going to be the new Secretary of the College. But actually Claire is probably the most important of us because she's a busy frontline emergency general surgeon, and we're going to be exploring some of these issues related to COVID with her, particularly related to frontline working. But before we get into the sort of the meat of the question and answer session, if I could ask Mike just to essentially give us a weekly update, what the college is doing to help with the wider issues related to COVID.
Thanks, Tim, and thank you for chairing this. It's great to be here on this lovely summer's evening. I'm looking out there. There may be some of you that are probably having a gin and tonic or perhaps a glass of orangeade or something like that. But anyway, it's great to have you with us, and it's great to have our Vice Presidents, Raj and Rowan, and our Honorary Secretary-elect, Claire, with us. It's important to update you all and what the college is doing. You all know that it's physically closed, but it's virtually open, and 3/4 of the college staff are working full-time at home, and it's brilliant that the IT department have made that happen. And basically it's continuing the seamless provision of all the activities of the college. And clearly, there are some aspects that are not working to capacity or not working at all. In fact, things like the overseas activity of exams, scientific meetings, ceremonies, and such like have been markedly curtailed for obvious reasons. And I'm sure Raj will come on to that when he speaks in a little while. Examination activity, that's been diminished, of course, but we're hoping, even expecting, to restart domestic exams in dental, surgery, and the faculties in September. Not definite, and it all is dependent, but that is what is hoped. And particularly if it involves clinical exams, it will be with social distancing. The exit exams like FRCS still up in the air, but hoped to be back up in November, perhaps being held for all the specialties across the board in Edinburgh and Glasgow in November and December. Whatever happens, new exams will have to be in place by August 2021 when the new curriculum is put out. So there's lots to be discussed about that. What has the college done? Well, it's collaborated well with its sister colleges. We've put out guidance on PPE. We may come on to that later. We led that, and in fact we had something to do with the revision by Public Health England in its guidance on PPE. And we put out guidance on the recovery phase, CT scanning, and so on. So it's been quite useful, I think, for that collaboration with the colleges. If it comes to ceremonies, the diploma ceremonies, well, there hasn't been any since March, and it's unlikely that that is going to restart until well to the end of the year, if not 2021. And it's one of the lovely parts of our friendly college, if you like, and we all truly hope that that's going to be back up and running in the early part of next year. The Triennial Meeting, which would have been running this week, actually, and brilliantly put together by Rowan, who is just a genius at running such big international meetings. and he's been charged by me to do this again next year, this time next year. It was a fantastic program, looking at how we were making it better for everybody, particularly making it better for women and making it better for everyone. And I'm hopeful that the stellar cast that Rowan had assembled are going to be here next year instead. So that's another challenge there for Rowan, and he might want to talk about that. When it comes to education, well, face-to-face courses and things like that have all had to go by the board, but already there are MRCS remote online courses planned, and of course our series of webinars. And we're here, it's Monday night at 7 o'clock, it's the Edinburgh College webinars, and these have been developed and they've been there for medical students, FY1s, FY2s. We really have tried to deliver for all our members and fellows and affiliates. And the COVID series here, this is, I think, the 20th of this series, which has been, we've all enjoyed taking part in, and I hope, and it would seem that nearly 20,000 have registered to be part of. So we've also run committees. All our committees have run the same way, with Zoom or with WebEx or with Starleaf, and that has worked extremely well. And I think that the one thing that we have learned is that there are good things that have happened that we can bring into the NHS, but also into our college, which will be the way that we work in the future, which may be more sustainable with less traveling, but more remote working. And I think that we may touch on some of those things later on. So that, in essence, is where we are. The college is open for you, and I'll hand back to Tim, who's going to chair tonight. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Mike. I can see that there's now over 150 participants in the webinar, so welcome to those that are just joining a little bit late. Please type your questions in. We'll do our best to get through as many of them as we can this evening, and if not, we will come back to you afterwards with hopefully satisfactory responses. I think just as way of introduction, I think it's particularly appropriate to talk about COVID and the impact on surgery in general this evening. The headlines of the Daily Mail for our international colleagues that have joined us is the most widely read newspaper in the UK, if not the most informed. However, its headlines today were there was 2.4 million patients caught in the COVID cancer backlog. And if I can just read a little bit of what was written today: patients with cancer, heart problems and other life-threatening ailments are feared to have died at home as the NHS turned its focus to the pandemic. Alarmingly, delays in cancer surgery alone will cost more lives than the number of virus patients saved in hospitals. And that was a prediction from Britain's Institute of Cancer Research, as reported by the Daily Mail. So it's on that background, really, that we're having the discussion this evening. So I think to begin with, we'll turn to Clare McNaught, as I said, a jobbing general surgeon specialising in colorectal surgery in York. And Clare, what's your approach at the moment to dealing with your elective and emergency surgical practice in this COVID era, and being cognizant of the headlines in the Daily Mail today?
Well, thanks very much, Tim. Well, I think if you ask any frontline surgeon, they'll tell you the same thing, that the first phase of the pandemic was easy to deal with. We just stopped everything. We got the hospital sorted out to deal with the first wave. And that was quite straightforward for us surgeons. I'm telling you, the second wave, where now we have to get safe elective surgery and diagnostics back online, is much more challenging. And it's happening at a time when the surgeons are actually tired and exhausted from doing all the on-call, because we lost all our juniors before. So it really is quite a challenging environment. Now, the reason why it's so challenging is because we know from the data from COVID surge, for example, that was published in The Lancet last week, that if you get a perioperative COVID infection, your outcome, even with minor elective surgery, can be dire, including mortality. So we have to make sure when we bring patients in that it's safe for them to come in. And this is what you have to think about when you're trying to plan your elective services. Now, when you're planning elective services, there's really 4 things you need to think about, and we call it the 4 S's. It's the site that you're doing it, the staff that you need to provide it, the stuff, and that includes all the PPE and anaesthetic drugs and all the other kit that you need to provide it, and then the systems you have to have in place for your patients, such as isolation, swabbing, all of those sorts of things. So when you're replanning to open elective services, you have to go through all of those things. Now, if you're lucky enough to work for a big organisation where you have lots of big hospitals, might be quite easy, because you can just say, okay, this is the clean hospital or green hospital that they like to call it, and then all the COVID stuff can be put somewhere else, and then so really you can get your services up and going quite quickly. And places such as Oxford have done that already very effectively. But most cancer surgery, cancer diagnostics aren't done in major centres. They're done in the district general hospitals, and we are really having to fight hard to try and set up all these new services. And most of us, what we're having to do is we have to really think about the site, and we're having to perhaps block off areas of the hospital to try and make a clean area with separate entrances, that all patients and staff who come in to that area are actually fully tested, to make it safe for them to do that. And that's a huge challenge. And if I can tell you that I'm meeting with the exec board this week, we looked at 17 business cases to try and support this activity, and in a small hospital like mine, that they were mounting up to over £7 million just to get these services put in place. So you can see that the challenges are really quite vast at the moment.
Claire, if I said to you that demand may well outstrip supply because of limitations to patient pathways, what would your feeling be about that?
Well, it already is. I mean, we've already got a backlog of patients waiting who haven't been referred. The one good thing that actually happened at the very beginning of the pandemic, and we've got a lot to thank our primary care colleagues for, they stopped a lot of the referrals coming in. They really triaged at primary care level, and most organisations were only getting about 10% of the normal sort of cancer referrals and stuff that we would usually expect, and the GPs have done a great job in triaging that. We already at all hospital levels, we are triaging all referrals, and we really are trying to prioritise the very high risk cancers. So for example, in my speciality, we've started using FIT stool sample testing, because we know that the higher you're fit, the more likely you are to have a colorectal cancer. So we're starting to try and use other methods to prioritise patients, so that we're really going to try and pick up the people who have cancer before everybody else. So we're having to incorporate lots of new modalities really to try and get the really high risk patients done first, but obviously there's going to be a delay for some patients.
Okay, if you don't mind, I'm going to slightly change tack. We had a question that came in earlier today. What are you doing about maintaining your physical and mental well-being at the moment?
Well, I've always tell people, if you want to be sane and be a surgeon, you should get yourself a dog, because it's an absolutely fantastic way of making you get out and walk and take physical exercise. I mean, I think, to be honest, I'm really concerned about the mental health of the workforce at the moment. Remember, a lot of surgeons are not working their normal roles. We're certainly not doing our normal job plans, so we're having to be incredibly flexible at how we work. Doing a lot of work from home. We're having to adopt lots of technologies, like telephone clinics. Everything's changing, and the guidance is also changing on almost a weekly basis. So it's been quite exhausting. I think in terms of as a department, we're doing a lot more consultant meetings virtually. Once a week, we're trying to catch up with each other, using MS Teams. That's been a real great thing, just so that we can just, try and see each other, because we've had to go into a shift patterns, we don't really see each other as much as we used to. So using lots of virtual technology, lots of WhatsApping, sending each other silly videos, just to try and keep a bit of humour about things. But I think it is an issue. Most organisations have got wellness rooms now, and you can pop in and there's usually cakes and cups of tea there if you wish. But I think most of them are actually just trying to get out and about in this beautiful weather as much as possible, and trying to stay in touch with each other as much as possible too.
I see that David O'Regan from the Faculty of Surgical Trainers and another cardiac surgeon like the reply about dogs. I don't know if he's going to get one now. So, okay. If you don't mind, Rowan, can maybe you just give us a little bit of general advice from your position really with NES about what you'd recommend, particularly to trainees about mental and physical well-being at this time? You're muted.
Thanks, Tim. I think there's no doubt all the training bodies, that includes the colleges and the wide spectrum of colleges and the statutory education bodies, are very conscious of the impact of the pandemic on well-being of trainees, as well as sort of the whole multidisciplinary team. But for trainees, I think we've tried, one, to produce a lot of guidance and information, alerted training program directors, educational supervisors and clinical supervisors to look out for their trainees and to look for any signs of them being under stress or feeling under pressure due to perhaps being in a very different environment, working even in a different specialty to what they're used to. We've only approved a lot of those redeployments if there's very good supervision in place. So I think there's been a really conscious effort, a very proactive effort. And there's also a lot of information available on websites, including the college website. The statutory bodies all have very good information. And you know, there's some very good national information sites. NHS Inform has got some great tips about well-being. Stay informed. You need to know what's happening, what the key decisions are, what the guidance is. So stay informed. Stay connected, and that was something Clare talked about. It's important that we keep up those sort of social contacts and encourage the trainees to look out for each other, and WhatsApp groups or informal VCs when you're not doing business, but just having a chat and catching up, and encouraging that with family and friends. And then having a healthy sort of work-life balance where possible, getting exercise, rest, and just having somebody to talk to. So I think there is a lot of good advice out there, but we are very conscious that this is an incredibly stressful time for people being in an unusual situation, in an unusual environment, and working with new and perhaps different people. So I think there's advice, and hopefully we'll all take a responsibility to look out for each other, and that includes the trainees.
Okay, Rowan, thank you very much. I'm going to, again, slightly change tack. There are questions coming in down the right-hand side, which I know that the rest of the panel will be able to see, and I'm going to come back to those, so you've been warned. But if I could just ask Rajesh, Vice President of the College with responsibilities for the international aspects of college work. Raj, I know that you've got a little bit of a feel for what our colleagues overseas have been doing about dealing with particularly elective surgery sort of post-COVID. Could you maybe give us just a review?
Thank you very much, Tim. First of all, I'd like to say that I was overwhelmed with the response from our colleagues from overseas. I sent out almost a dozen emails to surgeons all over the world, really, from Australia right down to South America. And the overwhelming view is about screening. Screening, the site of the hospital, the standard operating procedures, and the selection of cases. Most countries are screening their patients 24 hours before they come in. Most countries wish to inform the patients for elective surgery for 14-day quarantine. They come in, they have their COVID. Some countries get the results the same day. Some countries seem to get the results the following day. And then they decide whether this patient needs surgery within the first 24 hours or up to a 36-hour margin. Now, it's interesting that Hong Kong don't follow this rule or regulation, if you like. They felt that their numbers were so low that they could afford not to screen, but if the patients were symptomatic, then they would be stopped from coming into hospital and moved to a COVID location. It's also very interesting that the Australian health system, the Alfred health system, and I'm going to read this out from Melbourne, they wanted the resumption of elective surgery subject to review on a monthly basis. By 31st of May, in the state of Victoria, 50% of the normal elective list capacity of the list were to be performed. There's an appendix which goes through all of the operative procedures that they have selected, really because of what Clare alluded to regarding mortality and morbidity. By 30th June, they hope that 75% of their capacity will be operated on. And by 31st July, they hope to go back to their normal levels. They wish to prioritize category 1 patients first. If you don't have category 1 patients on your operating list, then you go on to category 2. And if you're unable to fill with category 2, then you go on to the breaches with category 3. Now, if you in your department don't have any of these patients, then you turn your list in to the managers so that it can be used. And I thought this was a great model, Tim, for the elective cases. Now, Malta also do the same 2-week self-quarantine, COVID testing, but they're also almost returning to normal in all of the surgical specialties. So it's obvious to me, it depends on the wave of the first COVID pandemic that has hit a variety of countries differently from us. So therefore, there are a group of people out there who feel that they don't need to test. There are a group of people who are still cautious. And one country, Malaysia, has decided that they will have a COVID hospital in each city. So for instance, in Kuala Lumpur, they have the Sungai Buloh Hospital, which takes all of the COVID patients. All of the non-COVID patients go to the other hospitals. But they also wanted to be cautious, and if patients turned up, as some would, who don't understand the symptoms in their own areas, then they have hybrid hospitals where they take on the non-COVID people and send the COVID-affected patients to the COVID center. So that, if you like, has been a great understanding for me as to how various people do things in their own environments. Now, in India, Tim, there's a dichotomous situation. You have the private sector and the public sector. Now, the public sector seem to have a very organized SOP, and the way they have a protocol. They also test for COVID and treat their patients as emergencies and semi-emergent and elective. The semi-emergent or all cancer surgery, they have taken on a lot of malignancies because they turn up late in any case in a lot of these government institutions in India. In the private sector, they seem to be charging enormous amounts of money for COVID testing, for putting them in a COVID environment, and also for the ventilators, because they've got to generate income. And, that's not something that we are used to, but that's the reality in the Indian environment.
So, Raj, what do you think the take-home messages are for us? What do you think we can learn from our international colleagues, in summary?
Tim, in summary, I think the Australian model of gradually increasing the capacity and having a COVID screening to make sure that you inform your patients well about what you're going to do. And I think to prioritize cancer before you think in terms of carrying out any elective cases like cholecystitis or appendicitis, which can be treated with antibiotics, and you can wait. I think that's the take-home message that I have learned from all of these overseas colleagues. And whether we can have non-COVID centers using the private hospital facilities is another area which we can explore.
Okay, so there's something there, isn't there, about considering other management options for what would routinely be regarded as surgical pathologies. You mentioned appendicitis and potentially hot gallbladders or cholecystectomies. Mike, as president, if I could come to you, Raj mentioned screening and testing, and I know that you've thought about this and been involved in some pretty high-powered discussions in relation to this. What's the college's position, or what should it be on screening and testing? You're muted at the minute.
I think testing is key to the recovery of surgical procedures. We've banged on for quite some time about developing COVID-lite or COVID-deficient or COVID-protected hubs or hospitals. And to a certain extent, that has actually developed. Some of the private institutions that were taken over by the NHS have continued to do for instance, breast cancer surgery, skin cancer surgery, quite effectively in a lot of cities. And they have been very much COVID-lite, COVID-free environments. But in order to develop such a COVID-free environment or COVID-lite environment, I think it's almost impossible at the present time to get a COVID-free environment. You have to do two things. One, you've got to make sure that the patients are tested at the start of the process before they come in. They isolate for 14 days. And then certainly within 48, 72 hours of them coming in for a designated procedure, they have to be tested again and made sure that they are negative. Now, that is the key to that is getting not just the test, the antigen test, but also the result back within 24 hours. And at the moment, whilst we hear that that is happening in a large proportion of those cases, the reality is not the case, that many patients are waiting up to a week to get their antigen test back. And so we have to really increase and develop that testing to make sure that not only do we have the test, but we get the test back within 24 hours. Because if you don't, you're not going to be able to go ahead with your surgery. And equally, it's again testing of the healthcare workers. We can't have a COVID-lite environment if we don't have the healthcare workers tested as well. And we were promised, and we heard today at 5 o'clock from the health secretary, that we have up to 200,000 tests available per day. But do they come back within 24 hours? And the answer is no. And we have to make sure that that happens. And Baroness Dido-Harding is there to develop this and to make sure that we do. But we have to test the healthcare workers working in these hubs. And you say, well, how often do you test those healthcare workers? Because, of course, one test is at a point in time. And the initial response was every 2 weeks. Well, I can tell you, and going back to what Raj was saying, in Hong Kong and in Singapore, healthcare workers working in COVID-lite environments are tested every day, and at very much worst, every other day. And we have got to get to that stage where we can ensure that our COVID-lite environments provide appropriate healthcare workers testing. As you heard from Claire at the start of this webinar, the outcome from COVID surge, the COVID surge paper that published in The Lancet, is that up to 30% of patients acquiring COVID in the post-operative period of major surgery in Italy and in China had a very serious outcome, a poor outcome. And so we have to make sure that we do everything possible, not one, to operate on a COVID positive patient in an elective environment, and two, that they are protected from developing it in the post-operative period.
Okay, Mike, there was an interesting question at the coming in towards the end, which is related to this. And what's your understanding of the role of antibody testing that the government is talking about?
So antibody testing is useful for healthcare workers, and it's being increased across the board and has been used in a lot of trusts. And I suspect even Clare's trust will have probably had many of their healthcare workers tested. And the early results suggest that up to 20% of our healthcare workers have been exposed and have developed antibodies, which have been seen on these antibody tests. That's the early figures, which is actually quite high and higher than a lot of people thought, and is encouraging in as much as we would hope might have, if they've developed antibodies, may have a degree of immunity. For how long, we don't know, and how effective, we're not quite sure. But if it's like others, then it may well be beneficial. So antibody tests are useful in us getting to understand how the disease has spread. What we need to know a bit more about is how effective the immunity that appears, the antibodies that appear to have been detected, actually confer on an individual, because that is something that we don't quite know yet.
Okay, so I've got lots of questions coming in down the right-hand side, and we've got almost 200 people that are here after 7 o'clock on a sunny Monday evening. So I'm going to try and ask as many questions as I can. It's a bit of like a quick fire round in Mastermind, and I'm going to try and limit the participants and the panel members to speaking for 1 minute or less. I appreciate that might be difficult, but here we go. Mike, when's the FRCS general surgery second part going to be held overseas? I think this is the JSCFE exam.
That is entirely dependent on overseas travel. At the moment, the FRCS overseas has a clinical component to the exam, and therefore the examiners have to travel, and we need to have unlimited travel without quarantining in order to deliver that exam. I can't see it happening this year, but hopefully early part of next year.
Okay, thank you. That was good. 48 seconds. Mike, what's the college doing about ophthalmology exams?
You mean the college or ICO?
Well, yeah, the college has had an interest in ophthalmology exams for some time. And
I would turn that back to you, Tim. I think you are in a better position to answer that question than I am.
Okay, well, to answer our colleague, ISO have taken over essentially the first part of the ophthalmology exams, with the Edinburgh College taking on the FRCS or the higher level examination. I think ophthalmology trainees will be treated fairly. You've put that in your question, but it's unlikely that those FRCSEd related exams will be commencing until into next year. So one for you, Rowan. What's the college going to do to ensure that trainees' development is not compromised? What can we do to help them get their elective surgery training? You're muted.
This is, thanks, Tim. This is vitally important. There has been a reduction in both elective and emergency surgery, so logbooks for the trainees are going to be reduced. There's a couple of further questions further down, so I'll try and combine several of them.
I saw one of them from Professor James Garden.
Yeah, so thanks to David and James for these. So just to let everybody know, there's been a lot of thought and effort put into this in collaboration with the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges and the regulator. But what the statutory education bodies have done is a derogation from the Gold Guide, and what that means is they have looked at introducing new outcome codes for the ARC-P process, and ARC-P Outcome 10, which is a no-fault option which allows trainees to progress, because prior to COVID, everything was going satisfactorily. But since COVID, their acquisition of competencies, of logbook experience, and exams, as we've been talking about, has been compromised. So at all levels, from core training through higher specialty training, there will be outcome 10s, which means they can progress and carry with them the opportunity of catching up. But it's the catching up bit that is going to be our biggest challenge. And I think that will be entirely dependent on what happens in terms of getting remobilization of clinical services, whether some of that elective surgery particularly, or perhaps cancer surgery, is done in the private institutions, and how we maximize the training opportunities. It means getting recognition for those sites for training with the GMC. But these are all things being considered. But the key will be to get clinical practice up running so that we can match whatever opportunities there are for training, and hope there will be some compensating in the next 12 months. And that also means for mandatory courses and clearly for the exam. So it's a big challenge, but the underlying principle is that the trainees won't be detrimentally affected now, and we will all have to work our hardest to get them those experiences. And that's what everybody's focused on from a training point of view. The reality, we won't know probably to this time next year. Have we been able to achieve that? I think there's implications for the college in terms of how we take education and training. I think there's going to have to be a lot more emphasis on simulation and alternative ways of getting clinical skills enhanced. And we're going to deliver a lot of our courses online, and James leads and has developed the whole Edinburgh Surgery Online, a fantastic online course. So we have access to fantastic material. So it's going to have to be a multi-pronged way of approaching both the knowledge base, the skills base, and the other, assessment for all our trainees. So that's maybe a little over a minute, but hopefully answers more than one question, Tim.
So thank you, Rowan. That was an Irish minute, but you dealt with 3 questions there. So Claire, if I don't mind coming to you, I suppose it's sort of a principle really. How long do you think we should be asking patients to quarantine following surgery?
Following or before. So there's a lot of guidance out that the national guidance is that before it should be 14 days, and in various societies their guidance afterwards is a bit different. So ACP for coloproctology again are saying 14 days afterwards. BOA orthopedic are starting to slightly go away from possibly self-isolation and talking about home shielding, because what we're starting, you wouldn't believe this, but already we're getting patients who say they can't self-isolate pre-operatively and post-operatively, and you wouldn't have thought that would be a problem. But what do you actually do with those patients? So I had a patient today, and they require the operation, but they won't self-isolate, so they can't come into the clean centre. We don't have, if I take them into the amber area to do their operation and they get a COVID related infection and have a complication, well, is that medically legally terrible for the patient? I know that's not the right thing for the patient, but they won't comply. So do we not just do an operation on those patients? So we're actually now having to start to develop a protocol of actually how to deal with the patient who doesn't want to self-isolate. And if anyone is out there is ahead of the game with this and want to send me theirs, that would be wonderful. But at the moment, the guidance is quite clear: 14 days before, for major surgery, 14 days after. How they do the self-isolation afterwards is, depending on your speciality, can be, it's variable.
Okay, that was a Glasgow minute, but you're allowed that. But I'll follow up with another question, if you don't mind, and that's really presumably you're doing some of your outpatient consultations using video conferencing and telephone conferencing. Just wonder how you're doing that and how you feel that that's meeting the needs of some of your patients.
So what we're actually doing is we're kind of doing we do some face-to-face still. So people who are going to come for surgery, generally we would have at least one face-to-face, because obviously you need to examine the patient and have a much more informed consent process. But actually I would say that if you asked me before COVID, could I do 90% of my outpatients by telephone, I'd have said absolutely no way. And now that's going to become the standard in the future. The patients like it. They're very happy with that. They do it from the comfort of their own home. And you can quite quickly, you can tell whether they just need to come in for diagnostics. And for example, if they have a colonoscopy and a CT scan, they probably don't need to be reviewed. They're quite happy with a telephone conversation. But people who have surgery will need to be seen face to face at some point. There are, interestingly, some of the companies who do provide preoperative information are actually developing distant consent processes where you actually can send information and consent forms digitally to the patients before you actually contact them. And I think that will become very much ingrained in our practice as time goes on.
I think you're correct. I think it's going to improve particularly the information that we give out to patients. I think it will accelerate the improvement in that. To change tack a little bit, Mike, coming back to you as president, just a question really about the college views on consultant job plans, as there's a bit of background noise at the minute that maybe NHS management may be pushing for changes to job plans. I just wonder have you got any thoughts about that? You're muted.
Can I just make a comment about what Claire said about isolation just before I come on to that? And
certainly, yeah.
And that is that I'm distressed to hear that patients are not prepared to self-isolate. Certainly patients coming in for major cancer surgery like esophagectomy, gastrectomy, pancreatectomy, liver resection and so on, it is in patients' interests, and my experience in talking to the major cancer units, patients are very well motivated to self-isolate when they realize that the risks of a COVID infection post-operatively are so severe. And patients are pretty focused on their own recovery and outcome. And I'm surprised to hear, and it may be with the less important operations like hernia repair, things like this, the mundane operations that are not life-saving, that patients may not want to self-isolate before. But my experience from talking around most of the cancer units and talking to Cancer Research UK, which I sit on the board, the word is that they are prepared to self-isolate. And I think that is absolutely essential for good outcomes. So I just wanted to make that point. So
I would say to you, answer the question, Minister. That was very helpful, but could you answer the original question?
I'm about to come on to that. If you let me get a word in edgeways. The job plans, I think, it is important to consider this because we may well need, as surgeons coming into the recovery phase here, to start working a bit more like the Europeans. The European surgeons operate 3, maybe 4 whole days a week rather than doing clinics and administration and so on. We routinely operate 1.5 days a week and maybe up to 2 in some cases. And it may be that in the recovery phase that in order to get waiting lists down, and it's going to be years before we make an impact on the waiting lists that have happened now. And we are going to have to operate in a different way. Remember, unlike, as you heard from Raj earlier on, in Hong Kong and places like this, they are, in Australia, increasing up to 75% by the end of next month. To 75% of normal. That's not going to happen here in the United Kingdom because of the cleaning of theatres and because of the risk of COVID infection. We've had it badly here in the United Kingdom. We will never get back to that sort of level of working this year. And so we have got to look at different ways of working, using other institutions like the private institutions to continue to work, and for surgeons to do more operating than they normally do in their day-to-day job plan at the moment. I think that there are going to be potentially a different way of working, just like we're not doing open outpatient clinics, we're doing virtual ones. We may well be operating more often than we do at the moment. Something has to give to give us bigger capacity with the restrictions that are necessarily going to be in place. Okay,
that was another very long minute, but thank you very much. So If I could just sort of ask the panel a general question now, and that's, what do you think? Maybe start with Claire, and then if Raj may like to comment from an international perspective, what do you think the approach should be to quoting risk to our patients at the moment in this peri-COVID era? How are you approaching that?
Well, essentially, the only sort of really reasonable data that we have is the first COVID surge paper, which is just been published in The Lancet, which has about 1,200 patients from 24 countries in all various specialities. And I think that's probably overestimating the risk, but I think that's the sort of the best data we have at the moment. And I wouldn't want to frighten patients to tell them that if they got COVID, they would 1 in 4 chance of dying after colorectal cancer surgery. That's not the way you put it. But basically, we as Mike says, what we do is we say, look, you can help us reduce this risk. We have provided you the best facilities with minimal risk of COVID in them. You have to help us with that by self-isolating. But I tell them, if you do get COVID, you are at risk of respiratory disorders and even increased mortality. And I think you have to be absolutely honest about that. And we actually now have a separate COVID consent form, so that you have your own procedure-specific consent form, but we also have a hospital COVID consent form that documents all of this.
Okay, I think that's very helpful. Raj, were you able to ascertain an international approach to risk in elective surgery at the moment? You're muted.
Tim, it's an extremely heterogeneous group. You deal with internationally, and the consent process seems to be reasonably uniform from all my emails that I've got back, because that was one of the questions that I asked. But it's obvious to me that the way that they seem to be dealing with this is to say that the patient who gets out of the operating room goes back to a ward without any intensive care management. The mortality quoted before COVID doubles. So if it's 2%, it's 4%, which is very arbitrary. I don't know how they come to that figure. Similarly, they've also said that if a patient needs to go into ICU and needs ventilation, then the mortality rate quadruples. So I don't know whether we can utilize that model in the UK, but obviously it's guidelines from various associations around the world. This is from Myanmar, this is from Singapore, with the Singapore College of Surgeons guidance. So there isn't any uniformity. And speaking to Malcolm, Tim, he says that they don't add any mortality figures for COVID at the present time, because in the last 3 months, they've just done the same number of dissections and the same number of aortic valve repairs as they did prior to the January 2020 time. So it's very difficult. I don't think I can give you an answer on that question.
Okay. I mean, back to Claire, if I may, do you think that COVID and potentially increased risk for our surgical patients, do you think that could swing the balance of evidence-based surgery towards maybe non-interventional procedures? And where do you think that balance comes, that pivot point? Quite a difficult question, but it's in cardiac surgery. I can see where we've got therapies that are not such major surgical interventions, and we've got guidelines that push patients towards surgery. With this increased risk, it may be reasonable to think about maybe such not such invasive procedures.
Well, I think like in, for example, colorectal cancer, because we've had to use some different treatment strategies to defer patients because we couldn't actually operate on them, in some ways it actually might start changing the way we actually look at some cancer. So for example, in rectal cancer, yeah, we didn't always give neoadjuvant treatment, but that became the standard as soon as COVID hit, and we went away from chemoradiotherapy to short course radiotherapy, and we've seen a number of patients who have just given short course radiotherapy and then delayed them, and we've seen some really dramatic results from that, and we are trying to capture that data through cancer, the COVID cancer surge database, because you might actually find by some of these other deferring treatments, these patients might actually, down the line, actually might end up having a better outcome, because we're seeing patients who maybe we've deferred for, say, 3 to 6 months, and actually, 3 months, and now they're on the repeat scans, they're getting complete pathological responses, which we wouldn't have expected. So I think that the COVID actually might change absolutely the approach to the way we deal with some cancers. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. An interesting question that's come in, or interesting point that's come in that maybe Rowan and Mike want to comment on, is that maybe some of the clinical teams now feel a little bit freer than from the sort of command and control elements within the NHS. Maybe they've got a bit of discretion to do and think a little bit out of the box. How do you think maybe the management or organisation of the NHS might proceed in the future? Again, a difficult question, but that's why you're here. Okay.
So I can maybe comment on just some of the conversations I've been privileged to be part of at a sort of Scottish-wide level, and it's about capturing the innovation that has occurred, because there's no doubt there's been a lot of new things, new ways of working, a lot of which has been clinically led, have been hugely beneficial. Some of that has been around unscheduled care and new pathways and new ways of triaging. So I think there's a real sense of commitment to capturing what's been good and learning from it and having the clinical voice heard. And that's, from a lot of our medical directors across the health boards in Scotland, but talking together in sort of a very unified voice of what we want to keep that has been good. So I think, yes, management, all sorts of ways of looking at a local, regional, national level will be looking for efficiencies and new ways of working. I think the important aspect in all of this is to make sure the clinical voice is heard, because I think they have seen areas of good practice, and so capturing that, be it at a local, regional or national level, is very, very important. So there's opportunities as well as potential risks and challenges.
Okay, thank you very much. Mike, do you have a reflection on that? You're muted, I think.
Just to say that NHS England and Innovation, and Steve Powers in particular, has done exactly that. They want to capture all the good things that have developed from this outbreak, and I think one of the things that we've got to think about is the idea of cancer centres. I was never a fan of cancer centres as they have, for instance, in Tokyo, the National Cancer Centre, like the Royal Marsden, the Christie, and so on. In other words, cold centres for cancer care. But actually, this outbreak has demonstrated that that cancer centres such as those can develop into a COVID-lite hub, such that cancer surgery can continue in a relatively safe environment. But so much of the cancer work has normally been practiced in the hot and heavy hospitals around the United Kingdom, and very, very difficult to do that in the middle of a pandemic. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of thinking about reconfiguration of services such that we are not so disadvantaged as has happened with cancer care during these last 10 weeks.
Okay, thank you very much. A practical question that came in about halfway down, and again, probably give this to Mike and to Rowan. When do you think face-to-face courses such as ATLS, maybe training the trainers, maybe not quite so much that, things like knots, that they're likely to resume? And in what form do you think they might resume?
Yeah, so I think this is going to be one of the challenges. It is something we were moving towards, and I guess the technical term is blended learning. So there's, you do as much as you can online, but there's certain elements that require some face-to-face contact, and NOTS courses and some of the things like that are part of that, because it involves teams and team training and elements of communication. So I think we'll have to very much work out how to do those, given the restrictions that we have, which are all around social distancing. That's what's limiting some of these face-to-face courses. So the education team at the college is very much looking at what that means, how things can be delivered differently. It is going to take some workarounds, and we're going to have to comply with the regulations that are in place. So I think there will be increased use of simulation. I think there will be increased use of online education, but we can't lose the fact that at some point there will have to be skills and face-to-face courses that will have to be modified to take account of the regulations.
So I have to say, I participated in a face-to-face training the trainers course that happened within Trust, but there was 2 metre distancing. It was within a large lecture theatre. There wasn't really any physical contact, but of course things like ATLS, moulage, etc., that's maybe a different issue. Mike, do you sort of have an official position from the college about reopening for courses?
Just that at the moment that's not possible, but we're looking and as head of education, Rowan is looking at how we can deliver those with social distancing. I think that for anybody, members and fellows that are listening, they may well have listened to the webinar just a week or so ago with James Garden, Steve Ewell, Ken Walker and Vanessa Kay. Absolutely fantastic, talking about learning on e-learning. And James Garden started the ESO, the Edinburgh Surgery Online, and you have Steve Ewell, who's a doyen of the non-technical skills courses, and they are running a series of webinars on surgical simulation from the college that will help and inform trainees. As Rowan says, surgical simulation is going to play a big part in training, particularly in the early years going forward, and we are at the forefront of that, and we must develop that so that our trainees are not disadvantaged. So yes, e-learning, as with ESO and surgical simulation are going to be hugely important as well. But face-to-face courses are going to be diminished and more difficult to run, but we're working on it.
Okay, thank you very much. Rowan, I'm going to come back to you on this sort of for an official position. What's the role of the private sector at the moment in terms of helping to deliver elective NHS surgical practice, and what's the impact on that potentially on surgical training?
So this is something I'm aware is happening more in England. It's not particularly happening in Scotland or the other devolved nations to the best of my knowledge, but it is certainly happening in parts of England. As with any site where training has been undertaken, that site, that institution, that trust needs to have GMC approval for training. So as long as the private institution has GMC approval, then the deaneries can use those facilities and the trainers to do training. So I know this is already happening. And I think that has to be something that we work very much in collaboration. So the official view is that it can be a place and a site for ongoing education and training, but the site needs GMC approval.
Okay, well, one point that's been raised is that, of course, the private hospitals will be wanting to get back to their elective private practice, because their practice is predicated on profit and making money. Is it possible to hold the private hospitals at the moment to provide this NHS work? Claire, have you got any observations from that from York?
Oh, sure. Well, at Margaret, I'm working with Harrogate, and we have taken over the Duchy, which is our private hospital, which has 2 theatres, and we started there today, and they're following all the same protocols that we are. the problem is that there's a bit of uncertainty about how long that will go on for. So I think the government did mandate that they had to do it to the end of June, but after that it will be a negotiation. So although we've been very grateful to them, it's actually allowed us to start some elective work there. There is a bit of uncertainty about how long that will continue, because as you say, they're a private business, and they'll want something from it as well. Okay, thank you very much. I'm aware that we're actually bang on 8 o'clock now, so we've had an hour, and I'm sure that people want to get their supper or return to what they normally do on a Monday evening. There's some fantastic questions that have come in down the right-hand side, and we will try and get responses to them as best we can. We'll keep a record of these questions and get back to you. Thank you, so many of you, for joining us tonight. Almost 200 fellows, members, and other colleagues. So what I'd like to do is thank the speakers on your behalf. Remind the audience that next Monday night's webinar at 7 o'clock is the recovery of elective orthopaedic surgery in this post-COVID period. And again, there'll be a star-studded cast for your entertainment and for your information. So please join the college webinar 7 o'clock, bringing your college to you series. So with no further ado, I'd just like to say good night from myself, and good night from all my colleagues on council. So it's good night from me, and it's
good night from him.
Good night from them. Good night.